Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we are talking to Tom Biebighauser about vernal pools. Tom is a wildlife biologist, wetland ecologist, educator, and author. Hi, Tom. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Hi, Shannon. Great to join you today.
So let's start out by telling everyone just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, my name's Tom Biebighauser, and I work as a wildlife biologist and a wetland ecologist. And I started doing this in 1979, so it's been a few years now. I worked a career with the U.S. Forest Service as a wildlife biologist, retired in 2013, and I've continued to work full-time restoring wetlands and streams. I focus on helping rare species of plants and animals, and I really like working with educators at schools to bring wetlands right to their schoolyard.
That's awesome. And I know that, the podcast is called Backyard Ecology, but I really use the backyard in very general, broad terms. And I know we've got school teachers listening who are always taking their kids out and doing stuff at their school pollinator gardens or school rain gardens, ponds, and stuff like that. So
Sure.
I know we've got a lot of the educators listening as well as the more informal educators like the environmental educators and stuff.
I'm glad you brought up backyards. In 1988, our family moved from Minnesota to Kentucky, and we bought a home in a subdivision with a 1-acre lot. And for our anniversary one year, we decided to build a vernal pool in the backyard. And this was a rather unique thing to do. So we checked all the bylaws and all the regulations and found out that we could do this. After all, we're in Kentucky. There's very little zoning in most places.
Mm-hmm.
So I brought in a heavy equipment operator with a dozer, and we built this small vernal pool in the backyard. And it filled with water after one of the rains. We had a hurricane coming up from the Gulf, and that filled the wetland. And it was really great to see all the different frogs and toads and salamanders that started moving into this vernal pool. And our daughter just loved to be out there catching the frogs and toads. Our son, he liked making boats and floating them on this vernal pool. And then during the winter, when it froze, it became the place to ice skate for the neighborhood. So this was quite an attraction for all the children in the community. We had great blue herons coming into the vernal pool, all sorts of mallard ducks, and we saw about every wildlife species you could see in this vernal pool. And I think when it came to sell that home and to buy our farm, that vernal pool helped the new owners decide they wanted that place in a subdivision. So they really can be a joy to live around, and there's always something different that you see using these habitats.
Nice. Yeah, I fell in love with vernal pools probably 10-ish years ago. I've always kind of liked the wetlands and stuff, but it was about 10 years or so that I really fell in love with the vernal pools. But some of our listeners may not know what we're talking about with vernal pools. So can you kind of describe what that is? Because there are so many different types of wetlands. And today we want to really concentrate more on those vernal pools because we're recording this in mid to late January. And this is vernal pool time. This is the time when they really start to get exciting.
You're right. Well, a vernal pool is a special kind of wetland. It's a wetland that fills with snowmelt and rain during the spring. And then by the end of the summer, it generally goes dry. Now, I've worked as a biologist for a long time, and I remember early in my career seeing vernal pools and thinking, well, those aren't very good looking wetlands. After all, they go dry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what most people thought. If a wetland goes dry, how can it have any value? But maybe you've seen these when you're driving in the countryside. You'll see part of a farmer's field that's holding water in the spring, and then you'll come back when the crops are growing and it's dry. You were probably looking at a vernal pool that was natural, but now it's been drained. Now, these vernal pools are often quite shallow. Most of them are under 1.5 feet deep, and they can be quite small. Most of them are not even a 1/4 acre in size. In fact, most vernal pools that I visit that are natural really aren't any larger than your living room. but oh, are they full of life. But what we learned over the years is that these temporary puddles of water are just full of life. And a vernal pool, by definition, does not contain fish. If we want fish to live in a wetland, and fish are good to have in many wetlands, the wetland needs to hold water all year. But if we want a vernal pool and all the life that lives in a vernal pool, we don't want fish in it. So if that vernal pool or that ephemeral wetland goes dry once in a while, it can't support the fish, but it can support this diversity of animals that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, and exactly what you said about that idea of if the wetland goes dry, how can it be a good wetland? That's why I never really, up until about 10 years or so ago, paid much attention to vernal pools and thought they were just kind of there. But for that very reason, I kind of had that same bias. And then I had the opportunity to do some research with some students. And oh my
Good.
gosh, like you said, it was amazing what all
Good.
we found there.
Oh, if you want to hold students' attention, bring them to a vernal pool, give them a dip net, and you wouldn't believe what they will capture. Because vernal pools don't contain fish, they do contain this wide diversity of animals. I mean, I think of all the frogs that you see that are breeding in a vernal pool. We see wood frogs in vernal pools. We see this toad that we call the spadefoot. It's capable of burrowing into the ground great distances. Gray tree frogs will breed in vernal pools. Then we have all the salamanders, and the list goes on and on. We have spotted salamanders, we have marbled salamanders, blue spotted salamanders, Jefferson salamanders, four-toed salamanders, red spotted newts, tiger salamanders. I mean, you get the point. There's a lot of salamanders that use these vernal pools.
Mm-hmm.
And they're in there because when they enter the vernal pool to lay their eggs, then they don't get eaten by fish. And their eggs can hatch and their larvae can grow up. And more than likely, the predation won't be as great. So they can reproduce and emerge and get onto dry land and live the rest of their life cycle. But because a vernal pool is so full of life, we often see snakes like garter snakes, the eastern garter snake, maybe the red belly snake, the ringneck snake, and they're hunting the frogs and the toads and salamanders. Now, we have one vernal pool on our farm that supports Fowler's toads and American toads. And in the spring, we hear this long, beautiful trill, and that's the breeding call of the male. And they will only successfully breed in vernal pools, again, because their eggs and their larvae don't get eaten by fish. Now, I love fish, and on our farm, we have one large pond, and this large pond has fish in it. When the grandchildren come over, we go fishing in the farm pond, but then we hike up to the top of the ridge, and that's where we catch the frogs and the toads and the salamanders in the vernal pond. So really, wetlands are different from each other. We have those that hold water all year. We have those that don't. And the vernal pool is one of these specialized wetlands, and we've lost so many of them to drainage. And I'll be talking about that in a few minutes.
And yeah, I mean, most people that I've met, they may have vernal pools on their property, but they don't realize it because, like you said, it's only wet for part of the year. But yeah, and it may be a very small thing, but there's so much that's there. And like the fairy shrimp was one that really surprised me.
Yes.
And yeah, that was really fun because the first time I saw them was when I was working with these students and we were doing wood frog egg mass survey. So we were going out in the vernal pools, counting how many wood frog egg masses there were because wood frogs breed very, very early in the season. And it was amazing. I mean, I was helping some of the students get ready to go in the pond because we didn't have enough waders for everybody. So about half of us went in at once while the others kind of took data, looked around, did that sort of stuff. And then the next pond would switch up. And we got to one of the ponds and one of the students was like, Shannon, there's fish in here. I was like, there can't be fish in here. They're like, there's fish in here. And I was like, no, the pond dries up. There can't be fish in here. How can there be fish in here? They're like, well, then what are these? And I went over there and looked. And I was like, okay, I see why you think they're fish, but they're not fish. They can't be fish. So we took a bunch of pictures and then I had to go back when the day was over. I had to go back and look it up. And Then by the time the teacher and them all got back to school, because of course they had to drive further, I had already emailed the teacher. It was like, they're fairy shrimp and this is what. And so then the next time I think we spent a good amount of time looking at the fairy shrimp.
Oh, that's a great story. The fairy shrimp is an indicator that you are looking at a vernal pool. And just like the wood frog is an indicator, because this is where they can breed successfully. And the fairy shrimp is just fascinating because their egg is really a cyst, and this cyst is really durable. When a vernal pool dries, that cyst will fall to the bottom and will become embedded in the sediments. And when rain returns and fills the vernal pool in the spring, then that cyst will hatch and the fairy shrimp, again, you'll see them in the vernal pool. Now, we're often wondered, how durable are these cysts of the fairy shrimp? And I came across a story from Australia where a vernal pool had been dry for 400 years and it filled with torrential monsoonal rains, and the fairy shrimp hatched after being dormant for 400 years.
Oh my gosh, really?
Came across another story, and this is from the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and it was about the brine shrimp, which is a crustacean and a relative of the fairy shrimp. And the scientists were taking core samples in the Great Salt Lake, and what they did is they added water to the core samples, and the brine shrimp hatched. And the core sample was 10,000 years old.
Oh, wow.
So this is why when I restore a wetland area, I save the topsoil, I put it in a pile, and when we finish recontouring the restored wetland, we spread that soil in the bottom, and who knows, we may be bringing back the fairy shrimp that have thought that it's just been a very long drought. But it's amazing, the fairy shrimp, and what you can tell students about them. I always ask students, how do you think the fairy shrimp were able to get into this vernal pool? And they say, well, maybe they flew here. And I said, well, fairy shrimp don't fly. Well, maybe they blew in here. Well, it's possible that when it's dry, the cysts would blow, but it's not likely. And I tell them, you know how they got in that vernal pool? They were pooped in it. And they look at me and they say, what? And the predaceous diving beetle will pick up the cysts of the fairy shrimp, and it will fly to another vernal pool, and it will defecate, and it will stock that vernal pool with the fairy shrimp, as well as other crustaceans. So who knows, how you were moved around. But it's amazing. We'll build a vernal pool in an area where there are no other wetlands, come back in 2 years, and there'll be fairy shrimp in the vernal pool. And we'll find the predaceous diving beetles. We'll go, okay, this is how it happened. Pretty exciting.
That is.
So fairy shrimp, other people call them sea monkeys. Some children were able to grow sea monkeys by taking those cysts and putting them in water and then seeing them develop. And they're just fascinating to watch. And that's why it's so important when we get outside to have things to look at with students. And that's why at schools we've been building so many of these vernal pools, because they change with the season. And early in the spring, when there's still ice on the water, that's when those wood frogs will be in there laying their eggs. There'll be a little bit of ice and snow around the edge. And then we can teach about how the wood frog is one of the few animals we know that can freeze and survive. And that's what happens to them, is that they freeze, then they can thaw and not have the tissue damage. And they're one of the earliest breeder in the vernal pool. So then we ask the students, why do you think they want to lay their eggs so early in the spring? And once in a while, one of the students will say, well, that's because the water's going to dry and they need to develop and get out before the water dries. So we get them thinking about that. And that's why some people call life in a vernal pool life in the fast lane. You have to be in a hurry to develop and get out of there before it dries. And that's what we know about toads. Toads can detect when water levels are dropping in that vernal pool, and they can decide if they're going to emerge full size or half size. And they can adjust their development and come out different sizes so they don't get stranded when that vernal pool dries. So they really are just a fascinating place. And maybe, okay, we're in Kentucky, and I really like the eastern box turtle. That's one of my favorite turtles. And during the summer, you will find the box turtle burrowed into the mud of a vernal pool. And they're keeping cool, and they're also finding lots of things to eat in a vernal pool. And we'll also find other species of turtles. We're going to find the wood turtle using vernal pools and the spotted turtle. And we'll even find rare turtle species like the Blanding's turtle using it and the bog turtle using these vernal pools. So these vernal pools are really special. It's really fun to see them. And, if you're thinking, well, I don't know if I can find a vernal pool. Well, the best way to find a vernal pool is to drive around the countryside in the spring with your windows rolled down, and you'll hear the vernal pool. Well, how do you hear a vernal pool? It's all the frogs and the toads that are calling in the spring. And more than likely, they'll be calling from a vernal pool. Pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's one of the ways I look for them too. Or if I know where they're at, then I've got to always roll down the windows before I get to that spot during that time of the year, because I've got to listen to them. It's just deafening sometimes.
Yes. And also we find many dragonflies using these vernal pools. We have this huge dragonfly called the swamp darner. And I've seen these near vernal pools, and you think a bird is coming close to you, but it's just a big dragonfly. Then we also have the wandering glider. And this is a dragonfly that will breed in a vernal pool, and then it will migrate up to 11,000 miles.
Wow.
Could you think of a dragonfly flying 11,000 miles? It's just amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So vernal pools are special habitats. And how I got interested in vernal pools, I think the first vernal pool I visited was when our family was vacationing on the shore of Lake Superior. Growing up in Minnesota, it was a big deal to spend a week during the summer on the north shore of Lake Superior. And when you're walking around the rocks on the north shore, you'll find these puddles of water on rocks. And the puddles are only a few feet across and maybe only 10 inches deep, but they're full of frog and salamander and toad larvae and eggs. And we would find all these animals in these vernal pools on the north shore. Now, when I was in middle school, my 7th grade science teacher, Bill Schmid, took our class out on a field trip. And we went out to visit a wetland and a vernal pool behind our high school in White Bear Lake, Minnesota. And we were able to see all of this life and sample them using nets. And that's when I decided that I wanted to be a wildlife biologist, and I wanted to help make these vernal pools. So I'm convinced that children at a very young age can have a good idea what they want to do with their lives.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree. I grew up camping, hiking, always outside. We didn't own much land growing up. We just had basic house and lot. But behind our house, there was an old cattle pasture. And the gentleman that owned it, he only ran a few head of cattle at a time. So he had given my parents permission to allow us to go over there and explore, as long as we didn't mess with the cattle and as long as we didn't mess anything up. So yeah, I grew up out there all the time, and I always knew what I wanted to do. I just didn't know. I didn't know the term wildlife biologist. I didn't know anything like that, but I knew what I wanted to do. I just didn't know how or what it was called or anything. So
very good. Then also, if you're a gardener, there's reason to like a vernal pool. If you go near a vernal pool, you're likely to see the hibiscus or the marshmallow growing near a vernal pool. And a number of years ago, I was paging through an old dictionary, and I found this drawing of a hibiscus. And it said hibiscus, marshmallow. It said the confectionery known as the marshmallow is made from the juices of this plant. Well, now we use corn syrup. But years ago, that's how they made the puff and the marshmallow. And you'll see monkey flowers in wetlands, these bright yellow flowers, buttonbush, which have these round white flowers, and all these plants that help pollinators like the monarch butterfly, those grow in the moist soil around a wetland, especially like the cardinal flower that was named after the bright colored red robes that cardinals in the Catholic Church wore years ago. So the plants around a vernal pool are quite unique as well.
yeah, I was hoping you were going to talk about the plants, or I was just going to ask you about them if you didn't bring them up, because I mean, people think of, you either have wet plants or you have dry plants. In the vernal pool, we've just said it's wet during the winter and the spring and then dries up by the summer. So what could grow there? But yeah, the buttonbush, I mean, I absolutely love buttonbush. That's one of my favorites, and everything uses buttonbush. And then
Yes.
cardinal flower is amazing. If you want hummingbirds, plant cardinal flower, but it needs to be wet.
You're right. That moist soil is so important around the edge of wetland areas. And there are so many animals that live in that moist soil, and so much of the larvae of invertebrates will burrow into that moist soil. And then we have the shorebirds that will use the insects that are living in the mud around a vernal pool. So there's quite a diversity of wildlife that will use these habitats.
And it's great because when you have that, you've got this automatic miniature ecosystem there where everything's interacting and working together, and you get to see all the really cool butterflies and birds and the dragonflies, and then you get to dig in and see the dragonfly larvae, which is always so much fun, especially with students. But even big kids like me like to do that.
Yeah.
And the crayfish, and I mean, there's just so much there. And then you get to see the predation that goes on. And I mean, it's just part of the whole system.
You're right. You brought up crayfish. Crayfish live in vernal pools, and they'll hunt in that shallow water. And what happens when that vernal pool dries? They dig that burrow so they can follow the groundwater into the ground, because during the day they rest in that water so they don't dry out. And at night they'll come out and roam around the moist surface foraging. So the crayfish burrow is an indicator that there may have been a vernal pool once where you're looking. And I'll see that in farm fields. I'll see where there are crayfish burrows, and then I'll know there used to be a wetland here, more than likely a vernal pool. It's unfortunate that most of the vernal pools in Kentucky and in the Northeast, and really across North America, the majority of vernal pools have been lost to drainage. And why is that? Well, these were shallow wetland areas that didn't hold water all year. And what farmers would do is that they would drain them and fill them so they could have crop fields. And where we live in Kentucky, the large money-making crop was tobacco. And there's so much hill country, it was difficult raising crops because the soil would wash away. So the farmers learned that if they drain or fill this vernal pool, then they can have a very productive tobacco field. And that's where we see all across the Northeast is that the vernal pools were drained. In fact, I spend a lot of time in the Northeast, and somebody will take me out on a field trip. You know, they always want to show me their best vernal pools. And it's exciting to go out to these vernal pools. But what we find out is these vernal pools were affected by drainage. I was working on vernal pool restoration at Sweetbriar College out of the state of Virginia. And we were looking at natural vernal pools that had troubles. What was happening is that the water was drying so early in the spring that the majority of the amphibians were left high and dry. They were stranded. And the people I was with, they were thinking, well, maybe this was due to global warming. Well, I walked around the first vernal pool and I found evidence of a ditch. And that ditch had been hand dug probably in the 1700s to drain that vernal pool. And it was still draining the vernal pool. And we looked at several other vernal pools that day, and every single one of them had a ditch or two that were dug to drain them many years ago. So the vernal pools that we were studying, they were going dry, not because of global warming, but because somebody had drained them hundreds of years ago. So we've started programs in the state of Rhode Island and in Massachusetts and in New York, where we're restoring these vernal pools. And we're filling and disabling these ditches and bringing back these rare habitats. And the key to finding these vernal pools that have been drained is to look for ditches. And in many communities now, they have what we call LiDAR images. Mm-hmm. What was happening for development and for planning, the county or the municipality will have an airplane fly over the community and shoot radar at the ground, and they can produce a LiDAR image, which is an incredibly detailed topographic map. And what you can do is you can look at these LiDAR images and you can see shallow basins that have ditches coming out of them. And they really look like a tadpole with the tail being the ditch. And then this gives you an idea where vernal pools have been drained historically, and it gives you an idea where you can restore these habitats. But, you know, many people don't see the value in a vernal pool. And when I talk to a group about wetland restoration and vernal pool restoration, the first thing they bring up is mosquitoes. Have you ever been asked about mosquitoes?
Oh, yes. And I was going to ask you about mosquitoes on here just so that we could have this conversation.
Okay. So when I talk to a principal at a school, And the teachers at the school are interested in wetlands, and they'll say, well, what about mosquitoes? After all, that's why a majority of the wetlands were drained across North America, was fear of mosquitoes.
Exactly.
And this is what we see with a healthy wetland. When you visit a healthy wetland, you can ask students to take a dip net and to dip it. And when they dip the water of a healthy wetland, they're going to bring out salamander larvae, frog larvae. They're going to bring out water boatmen, water striders, diving beetles. They're going to bring out water scorpions, but they're not going to sample the larvae of mosquitoes. And also, when you go to a healthy wetland or a vernal pool, you'll watch the students and they won't be swatting mosquitoes because there's no mosquitoes flying around. And then you wonder, what's going on here? Everybody assumes that wetland is a mosquito breeder. It's actually quite the opposite is true. That wetland is a sink for mosquitoes. And what we have found is that a mosquito will lay its eggs in a vernal pool. It will lay its eggs in a wetland. But then there's something in that water that's going to eat those eggs and eat them in a hurry. Whether it's the dragonfly larva or the salamander larva or the diving beetle larva, they're going to eat those eggs. And if some of the eggs do hatch, then these same animals are going to eat the larvae of the mosquitoes. And what happens then at night is that we have bats flying around, and the bats will consume the adult mosquitoes, and during the day it will be the tree swallows. So the thing to remember about a wetland, about a vernal pool, is mosquitoes may check in, but they won't check out. And we've seen this at schools. I've had classes with me while we're designing a vernal pool project at a school, and they're swatting mosquitoes. I come back a year later and we sample the life in the vernal pool, and they don't find mosquitoes. They don't find mosquito larvae. And they're amazed. And one of the things that we'll do at a school is that we'll go on a hunt for mosquito larvae. And I remember one school in eastern Kentucky where we found the mosquito larvae in a coffee cup. One of the teachers had left a coffee cup outside. It had filled with a little bit of water, and it was full of mosquito larvae. That's not a healthy wetland. Or if they go home, they may have left a toy outside, a plastic toy, and that puddles a little bit of water. Well, that's not a healthy wetland, and that's where you're going to find the mosquito larvae. So we have yet to find mosquito larvae in one of these healthy wetlands. And I talk to people who are experts with mosquitoes, and they tell me if that wetland you build or that wetland you restore holds water for more than a couple months, then it will attract the dragonflies, the damselflies, the salamanders, and the frogs, and you won't have mosquitoes. But if your wetland only holds water for a month or less, then more than likely you will have mosquitoes. So it's something to be thinking about. If you're worried about mosquitoes, don't be worried about wetlands because they are not breeding those mosquitoes.
Yeah, and I can say the same thing. I've done lots of pond studies and dip nets and stuff like that. And we almost never, if ever, pull up a mosquito larva at all. It's always all the other cool predators and invertebrates. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I talk about all the time. I like to have those functioning ecosystems. And the same as you, I've noticed where away from the wetlands, I'll be swatting mosquitoes. But once I get close, it's like, this isn't as bad at all.
Yes. And it's interesting, the animals and how they've adapted to the water in these wetland areas, these vernal pools. The spadefoot's one of my favorites. The spadefoot is the toad that can burrow deep into the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And the spadefoot, when it lays its eggs in a wetland, it can usually develop within a month, maybe 40 days at the most. And they are a species that they don't want anyone else in the water with them. And you'll find spadefoots using habitats that no other amphibian can use. And these are some of the rarest, they probably are the rarest amphibian that we find in the Northeast is the eastern spadefoot. So we've been building wetlands that only hold water for 2 months or less. And the only time they fill is with a huge burst from a thunderstorm. And when you get one of these torrential rains of like 5 or 6 inches,
Mm-hmm.
that's when these vernal pools used by the spadefoot will fill, and that's when they get used. Now, most of the year, that spadefoot is deep in the ground, in their burrow. And you wonder, how in the world do they know that it's raining hard enough for them to come to the surface and to lay their eggs. And you wonder about that. That spadefoot could be down 2 meters in the ground. How does it know that it's rained enough?
Yeah.
And we've found this out a number of ways. One of the ways is by barometric pressure. When you have quite a storm event, the barometric pressure drops, and the spadefoot can detect this, and then it will come to the surface, knowing that there's a torrential rain taking place. Another way is vibration from thunder. And I came across one story of construction workers who were widening a road, and they were near a vernal pool, and they were blasting the rock. And suddenly they saw spadefoots hopping around the road they were working on. They felt the vibration in the ground, thinking it was a thunderstorm, came to the surface, and I'm sure they were quite disappointed there was no water in which to lay their eggs. So just fascinating creatures.
That is fascinating.
So summer, I'm planning to go to Rhode Island, and we're going to be building wetlands with the University of Rhode Island, specifically to help the spadefoot, because the spadefoot was only breeding successfully in one vernal pool on Rhode Island. And this was a vernal pool that was made by humans by accident many years ago. So we're going there, and on purpose, we've been building wetlands, and we're planning to build more of these wetlands. And they're going to be quite shallow. We're looking at 8 to 10 inches deep in the middle. So a vernal pool doesn't have to be deep. They can be quite shallow to have these species using them.
That's nice. And that kind of goes to another human safety issue that I know gets brought up sometimes too, with having kids around these wetlands and stuff. We're not talking about something super deep. I mean, these are, like you said, oftentimes inches deep.
Safety is a huge concern. I know that when we moved into the subdivision and decided to build the vernal pool, the neighbors were concerned, what happens if my child falls in? That would be terrible. Well, you know what? I was told years ago that you could drown in 6 inches of water. Well, what I have found is that, yes, you can drown in 6 inches of water if you are standing up in a bathtub and you are high on drugs and you pass out. I mean, all you have to do is watch a child take a bath. And if that child tips or falls over, they're going to get their head out of that water so quickly. And I have taken thousands of students on field trips to vernal pools. And the first thing I find is that I have to encourage them to get close to the water's edge. Why? They're afraid of getting their tennis shoes muddy. And secondly, if they were to fall in the water, which they never do, if they were to fall in the water, it's quite shallow. The water is rarely up to their knees, and the bottom is soft, so it's like falling on a mattress. They'll never get hurt. I've only seen one child fall in the water near a vernal pool, and that's when the neighboring student pushed that child in, and that student got in quite a bit of trouble. But again, the student stood up, was a little bit muddy, ended up laughing, and no one was hurt. And we see that I built quite a few of these vernal pools in Canada, and they're quite an attraction at schools because they use them for ice skating in the winter. In fact, one of the vernal pools that we built, they shovel the snow off it every year so the students can skate. And every once in a while, a student falls through the ice, and guess what? They're in water up to their knees. So it's not a safety risk. So we've built hundreds of wetlands at schools and in people's backyards, and we find that there's no need to put a fence around that wetland because they're not a safety risk. The insurance companies, we treat them differently than a swimming pool. A swimming pool is deep, it has vertical sides, it has a concrete bottom, and you can drown in a swimming pool. But a vernal pool is shallow with gradual slopes, a soft bottom, and there isn't that risk of drowning. So I'm glad you brought up safety. I think it's perfectly fine to have a vernal pool in your backyard. You know, I think about growing up in White Bear Lake, Minnesota, and what we did is that we would hop on our bikes and we would bike to a vernal pool in the spring, and we would catch frogs, we would catch salamanders, and we would stand on logs, and we fell in many times, and that water was so shallow, there was no risk of our drowning.
Yeah. I mean, that's good too. And it's one of the things I always like to bring up when we're talking about things that at least have a perceived danger level to them. Because a lot of times, I mean, this is the Backyard Ecology Podcast. We're talking about things in our yards, in our communities, in our schoolyards, in more of our built environment. So we have to take in human safety as a higher priority than we might if it was way off in the middle of nowhere in a national park or a national forest. I mean, human safety is still an issue there, but it's not quite so high of a priority because you don't have the people there as much.
Okay, so we've talked about the value of vernal pools. We've talked about how they are safe to explore and how they don't produce mosquitoes. So why wouldn't you want one in your backyard?
Exactly. So how do we do this? And are there things that we need to think about?
First of all, we want to protect the vernal pools that you know of. If you know of vernal pools in your community, we want to protect those. We don't want somebody draining them or filling them. But if you want your own vernal pool, more than likely you can build one really no matter where you live. And it isn't that difficult to do. They don't have to be large. I have seen vernal pools the size of a desk produce clam shrimp and marbled salamanders. So they don't have to be big. They just need to hold water for probably 2 to 3 months would be best. Even 9 months would be fine if they're larger.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have to be ornate. You don't have to surround them with rocks. You certainly don't need a fountain. You don't need a water source or a stream. Now, vernal pools are pretty much isolated wetlands. What does that mean? They don't have a stream coming into them. They don't have a stream coming out of them. They can be located on top of a ridge or a mountain. So if you want to build one of these in your backyard, I suggest finding a level area. I suggest going maybe to the back edge of your backyard, not in your front yard. It'll grow up and everybody will think that you're lazy, you don't mow your lawn. So maybe if you go to your backyard and you find a corner, you don't have to put any runoff in it. If you live east of the Mississippi River, you don't have to be concerned about runoff. Now, if you live west of the Mississippi, then you may want to take the runoff from your roof and put that into your vernal pool. Otherwise, it won't hold water very long at all. So we're finding a level area, and we're finding an area that you don't want to mow anymore. I know of people that have built these right next to their houses, and they get spadefoots using them. And they say it's a little bit of trouble sleeping in the spring when they're calling because they're so loud. But I think that's a good way to go to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing is make sure that you're not damaging an existing wetland. Check to see if there are sedges or rushes, or if water already puddles there in the spring. You may be looking at an existing wetland, and it's best not to disturb it and just to enjoy it the way it is. But I would suggest looking at a dry area. Now, many people have built rain gardens, which are fantastic. And if you have a rain garden, you know that that will fill up with water, and within 3 days, it will go dry. And if it held water much longer, it could breed mosquitoes. Well, I don't want you taking out any of your rain gardens, but what I'd like to see you consider is adding a vernal pool to your yard. And it's much like a rain garden, only it holds water long enough for these different animals to live and to breed in it. One thing you'll want to do after you find a place where you'd like to build a vernal pool is to test the soil for clay. And how we do this is that we take a shovel and we dig a hole in the center of where you'd like to build your wetland. And we look at the color of the soil. Clay is generally gray, it's generally brown, it can be red, and then you feel it. You add some water to that soil sample and you mix the water in, and when your hands are dry, you make a long and thin ribbon. And if you can make a long and thin ribbon that's at least 2 inches long before it breaks, there's enough clay where you can shape a shallow basin and compact it. However, most people's yards don't have enough clay, and then it will be necessary to use a liner. Don't go to Lowe's or the Home Depot and buy one of these liners. If you do, it will be treated with fungicides and algicides, and it will kill the life in your vernal pool. I recommend that you order a liner from a manufacturer that specializes in aquatic safe and fish grade liners. And one of these manufacturers will make the liner any size you want. And these are fish grade, aquatic safe. They're made out of PVC. They're made out of EPDM. One of the popular brands is called Firestone Pond Guard. And these are aquatic safe, And you can take this liner and you can place it in the basin that you dig, and then you could put soil over it. And it's important to cover the liner with soil. This way animals can burrow into the mud in your vernal pool. The soil protects the liner from ultraviolet damage. But more importantly, the water levels are going to fluctuate in your vernal pool. And if you don't cover that liner with soil, then there'll be an exposed edge of the liner. And that gets really hot, and it can fry the amphibians as they're trying to leave the vernal pool in the spring.
How deep does that soil need to be?
I recommend covering the liner with 6 inches of soil. Now, if you visit my website, you will find the books that I have written about building wetlands, and I recommend visiting my website and obtaining a copy of one of these books, and it will take you through all the different steps of sampling soil, measuring slope, determining whether or not you need an aquatic safe liner, and then how to go about building this wetland area. Remember, gradual slopes, shallow, and it's okay if it goes dry. Now, when I was working for the Forest Service, we began building vernal pools in the 1980s. And I remember one of the foresters coming in one day and said, "Hey, Biebighauser, I saw one of your ponds. It was dry." And he happened to say this right in front of the district ranger, trying to embarrass me. Well, that's the hard thing to understand. When you build a vernal pool and it dries in the summer or fall, that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to make up excuses. You met your objectives. And in some years, it will hold water long enough for amphibians to develop. Some years, it won't. That's why at some schools, we have built 5 or 6 of these, all different depths. And that way they hold water different amounts of time. And in any given year, the wood frog can be successful in reproducing, or maybe one of the species of dragonflies or fairy shrimps. So in building these vernal pools, again, they don't have to be large. And one of the companies that I recommend ordering liners from is called Fab Seal Industrial Liners. They're out of Oklahoma. You can go to just search for their website, Fab Seal Industrial Liners, and they will set you up with a liner of any size that you want. And then I recommend that you protect that liner with fabric. We call it geotextile. And I generally place that fabric under and over the liner before covering it with soil. And it is a process building one of these vernal pools. If you build one at home, you can build, if you provide the labor, I think you could build a vernal pool in your backyard for almost no cost if you had clay soils. But it's important to compact those clay soils, and they're very difficult to compact. If you don't compact the clay soils when you build a vernal pool, more than likely it will only hold water a couple of days, like a rain garden. So if you are building a vernal pool in your backyard by hand, I recommend going to the local equipment rental business, and I recommend that you rent one of these thumpers. Now, maybe you've seen people on construction sites, and it looks like an overgrown lawnmower, and it thumps the ground and it compacts it. So if you want to build a wetland by hand in your backyard, I say that you're not going to be able to get compaction unless you rent one of these compactors at a local store. Now, if you are building a larger vernal pool in your backyard, then I recommend bringing in a professional. And this professional can bring in an excavator or a small dozer, but these excavators work really well. And this operator could build this wetland for you in one day in your backyard using an excavator. Now, how much will it cost to build a vernal pool? Okay, if you have clay in your backyard and you do it by hand, and you rent one of these pieces of equipment, it'll probably cost you $300-400 at the most to build one of these vernal pools. However, if you are at a school and you want a larger vernal pool, let's say you want a vernal pool 40 foot in diameter and maybe 16 inches deep in the middle. Well, if you purchase the materials and hire a contractor, you're probably looking at about $12,000. You think, wow, that's a lot of money, Tom. Well, it is. But, since I retired from the Forest Service, I've been traveling quite a bit, teaching workshops on building wetlands and building wetlands. And my wife said, it's time to remodel the bathroom. And I said, why? What's wrong with it? It's been, it looks great. She said, well, it's been the same for 20 years. I said, what's wrong with that? Well, That's what happens when you watch Home and Garden TV. You find out it's time to renovate. So because I was traveling, we hired a contractor who did an excellent job. And I'll have you know that I could have built 3 vernal pools for the cost of remodeling that bathroom. Remarkable. So it's all in how you put your priorities. Maybe you want to forego a vacation for 1 year and take that money and build the best vernal pool you can in your backyard. And again, your children and your grandchildren will really be able to enjoy this, and you'll be able to see things. And again, you don't need to put a fountain in it. You don't need to make one of these artificial streams with rocks. And if I learn that you have placed rocks around the top edge of the liner, I will visit with you and help you remove those rocks, because you don't see that in nature. You want this vernal pool to blend in. And during late summer and fall, it will be growing these plants. But in the spring, it will be full of life. It'll be a unique environment that requires really no maintenance. Oh, okay, there is some maintenance. All right, if you build a vernal pool in your backyard and cattails start coming in, please remove the cattails. The cattails will take over. Yes, I know they're natural, but they will take over all the open water just like a weed. And if you have cattails growing in your vernal pool, that tells me you made it too deep, because cattails do not do well when the vernal pool dries out. When the vernal pool dries out, the soils will bake, and that will kill the cattails. So if you have cattails growing in your vernal pool, then I suggest you remove the cattails and consider filling your vernal pool and shorten that hydro period so it will dry out. And the same thing comes true with this grass called reed canary grass. If you have reed canary grass growing in your vernal pool, which happens in the Northeast, then your vernal pool is probably not deep enough. If it's deep enough, it will hurt the reed canary grass. So there is a little bit of maintenance. It also leaves. I've built small vernal pools, meaning like 10 foot in diameter, and they're overtopped by oak trees. And this is great in the forest. It's great for salamander breeding, but I find that these tiny vernal pools can fill with leaves. So every year I'll take a rake and I'll remove the leaves from the vernal pool, and that way it won't fill completely with the leaves. Now I know the leaves are natural, but most vernal pools that we find in the woods are large enough so that they don't fill with leaves. And when that vernal pool dries, the leaves will decompose. They'll actually become soil. So you wonder, how long can a vernal pool last? Mm-hmm. What do you think? 5 years? 10 years?
I'd say even longer than that. I'd say that probably, if it hasn't been drained or the surrounding watershed hasn't been manipulated, I'd go for hundreds of years.
I agree. On the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky, we've been doing research on vernal pools that are natural. And these are natural on tops of mountains. And there's one that I can think of called Cliff Palace Pond. It's a natural vernal pool. And we did the carbon-14 work on it and all the sediment sampling and all the pollen analysis. We found out that natural vernal pool was over 10,000 years old.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
I have worked as a wildlife biologist for over 42 years, and I find that everything we do to improve habitat is temporary. It all requires maintenance. If you put in a food plot, it requires maintenance. Mm-hmm. If you plant sunflowers, you have to maintain them. If you mow an opening, it will grow up to woods. If you plant trees, someday they'll fall over. But if you restore a vernal pool and it will last 10,000 years, that's a good investment. So if we can do something in life that lasts 10,000 years and helps wildlife every year, it's remarkable. So I work with biologists and ecologists all across North America, showing them how they can restore vernal pools that have been drained with ditches and filled in. And I involve them in the project. We select the sites, we build the vernal pool, and then we monitor it. And they will tell me that it's the most rewarding project they have completed in their entire life. They say this really does matter. You know, I've seen numbers out there that in most of the United States, most states, close to 90% of your wetlands have been drained and filled. And most of that drainage and filling was done by private landowners, by farmers, by people living in urban areas. So if we are hoping to reverse this trend in wetland drainage, where does it begin? It begins in your backyard.
Right.
You can build a vernal pool in your backyard. You can protect a vernal pool in your neighborhood. And there's many places to do this. Now, I happen not to like mowing the grass. I just like it. So any place that I can turn over to wildlife and build a vernal pool, that's a good thing. Now, on our farm, we have a narrow piece of land near the road. And when I was mowing it this past spring, I left deep tire tracks. And I'm going to build another vernal pool there. I'm going to take my tractor and scoop out a shallow depression. Only I'm going to make this one quite shallow because I want the chorus frogs to use it. The chorus frog is one of these species that will be in and out of a vernal pool early in the spring before the competition comes in. So you can make these any size and you can experiment. And that's the thing, if you build a vernal pool and it's not deep enough, well, just dig it a little bit deeper. It's good exercise for us, something to think about. Again, go to my publications and you'll find these publications on my website, which is www.wetlandrestorationandtraining.com. wetlandrestorationandtraining.com. And there's all sorts of publications that other people have written about vernal pools, about wetland restoration. If you're an educator, you can look up one of the photo albums I have posted called School Wetlands. You can look up one of the web albums on building wetlands with liners. You can see larger wetlands that have been built on public land, and you can see that it is possible to build a wetland of any size, and it isn't that expensive. And there is government funding for building these wetlands on public land and on larger farms. You know, if you have over 10 acres of land, more than likely there's a government program that will help you to restore vernal pools on your property. And what I recommend you do is that you contact somebody with the government and ask about this program. If you're in the Northeast, I suggest contacting the Natural Resources Conservation Service. But really, if you're anywhere in North America, in the United States, contact the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Let them know that you're interested in building vernal pools or vernal ponds, and you want to help rare species. And more than likely, they'll provide you with assistance. But you can also send an email to myself, Tom Biebighauser at gmail.com, and I'll help you with the design and construction of your wetland project. And it's amazing how many private landowners are building these vernal pools. I'm helping private landowners all across the nation build vernal pools. They're building them because they don't have to. They're building them because they want to, and they want to help the environment. So Shannon, I'll let you say a few things. I've been talking a long time.
Well, every time I get ready to say something, you answer the question I'm about to ask. So I just let you keep going. But yeah, no, thanks for that offer. And I do encourage any of our listeners who are interested in this to go look at Tom's publications and stuff. There's one book that he has that's downloadable, and I've downloaded it and already read it. And I've actually got a second of his book. Haven't finished reading it yet, just started glancing through it. But yeah, he's got a very easy to read style. Not complicated. I'm definitely not an engineer at all. And it's like really easy to understand and stuff. So I do suggest people that are interested in this go look at his stuff because he's got a lot of good information there. And I will have links to his website where you can find everything he's talking about. In the show notes, I'll also have his email address because I know sometimes it's hard to hear an address or hear an email address or a web address and get it written down on a podcast. So just go to the show notes and you can click on the link and go.
So many people doubt they can build a wetland. And I just say that most of the wetlands in the United States were drained by people that did not have a high school education. I mean, they were good hydrologists. So I am certain that with the web the way it is now and all the information out there, that you can build a fully successful wetland and it doesn't have to be expensive. And you can build these about anywhere. One place I'd like to build a wetland, and I've never built one, I'd like to build one on a rooftop. You see where people are gardening on rooftops now. And I bet if we built a small wetland on a rooftop, I bet it would be used by pollinators, and I suspect it would be used by shorebirds. So you can build these wetlands about anywhere. We have built them in major metropolitan areas Louisville, Cincinnati, Vancouver, British Columbia. I mean, you can build these in downtown areas. And I remember the first one we built at a school in Louisville. Some of the other ecologists said, well, why are you doing that? That's not going to get used by anything. Well, the teachers and the students started keeping track of all the animals visiting it. And the list was so long, you wouldn't have believed it. There's a lot of wildlife that live in urban areas.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see them in swimming pools where they end up perishing. So if you build one of these vernal pools, you're going to find many animals breeding in it. And you're going to see dragonflies coming in and butterflies, and you're going to be thrilled with the results. And people have sent me photos of wetlands they have built in their backyards. And they all tell me it's one of the most difficult projects they've done because of all the shoveling. I remember one set of vernal pools we built in San Francisco, California. We were at a school and the teacher said, no heavy equipment. And I said, really? Yes, we don't want any heavy equipment on our school grounds. We want to do this all by hand. So that teacher started bringing out students, a class of 30 every hour. And I would teach them how to use a shovel, how to use a rake. And after a half hour of digging, I think most of them understood what child labor was all about. And we built some beautiful vernal pools by hand, but they got a good appreciation of how hard it was to dig with a shovel for at least half a day. And we built a number of these vernal pools in downtown Kansas City, Kansas, and had the same experience. A lot of fun, a lot of hard work. When we're all done, we have this productive ecosystem that you can visit at a moment's notice. You think about how much work it is to take the students on a field trip with all the permission forms and lining up speakers. If you have a vernal pool in the backyard of your school and it's a sunny day, you can go out there for science, history, literature. You can teach about any subject at a vernal pool. So if you're an educator, you're interested in building a vernal pool at your school, please contact me and I'll work with you on that. And just special educators who have these vernal pools at their schools.
We didn't have anything like that when I was in school. It would have been absolutely amazing to have had that. And then thinking about it, even just at your own house. I mean, that's an amazing experience too. You don't have to go somewhere. You can just go outside in your own yard. And there's this amazing ecosystem to explore and to enjoy.
Yes. And you don't have to keep your vernal pool filled with water. People always say to me, oh, I need to top it off with a hose. Well, more likely if you top it off with a hose, you're adding chlorinated water, which is not good. However, if you're just patient, there will be another storm. And if your vernal pool that you make isn't holding water as planned, then you may need a liner, or you may need to find a way to compact that clay better so it will hold water longer. Because you look at how much rain we receive in the east, you don't need a watershed. You could build these, so we call them sky ponds. If you're in the west, again, I suggest putting some runoff from a gutter into your vernal pool, and that will work quite well. So they'll last a little bit longer. But it is fun. They're beautiful to look at. Go to my website and look at the many photos of vernal pools. I think you'll agree that they are very attractive habitats. And the fluctuating water is of great interest. You never know what's going to happen out there.
Yeah, exactly. And you were talking about they went dry and thinking that you had to top it off, but that's the whole point of a vernal pool, is that it's seasonal. These are ephemeral pools and ponds. They do dry up after a while, but that's part of that whole cycle and process and is what makes them different than a pond.
Yes, I agree. Well, I really appreciate you inviting me to participate in this podcast. And the more people are aware of the value of wetlands, I think the more they'll understand their importance and maybe even want to restore one someday.
Yes. So yeah, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating and very educational. And I really do appreciate you coming on and talking to us today about these vernal pools.
And I wanted to let the audience know that prior to this podcast, I was talking to Shannon, and she lives on a farm with 39 acres.
Mm-hmm.
And she's interested in building at least one vernal pool. And so I will be visiting with her, and we're going to find places to build these. And I'm aware of programs with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that will help pay for these. So I look forward to meeting you in person and designing this vernal pool and building this. And hopefully you'll be able to film part of this, and we'll let the viewers see what happens, how you design one of these out in the field, how you do the soil test, and then how you build it,
Mhm.
and then your reaction while construction's going on. I think it'll be exciting. I look forward to that.
Oh, yeah, I am so excited about this. I mean, you just absolutely made my day when we started talking about that, because this is something that my husband and I have been dreaming of for a while, but wasn't sure how to implement. So, yeah, I am over the top ecstatic about this idea and this opportunity. So, thank you so much for that. And yes, this will be something that we will be coming back to and sharing and talking with people about.
Very good. Good. Well, thank you, Shannon.
Yes, thank you. Have such a great day.
You too. Bye
All
now.
right, thanks. Bye-bye. I really appreciate Tom taking time to talk with us. Vernal pools are such an important and often overlooked ecosystem. Tom is definitely right in that there is a tendency to think of vernal pools as not as good as or less than other wetlands because they do dry up. But it's that seasonal nature of vernal pools and the fact that they dry up that makes them such special and valuable wetlands. In addition to all of the biology and ecology that he shared with us, I also enjoyed hearing Tom's stories about building vernal pools in his own backyard, at schools, and in other locations throughout the country. His work shows that you really can create vernal pools almost anywhere. However, Tom did want me to mention one more thing that he forgot to say while we were talking about creating a vernal pool. And that is that before starting to make a new vernal pool, you should check for any underground wires, pipes, etc. This is a basic safety precaution that should be taken before doing any construction work that involves digging or moving dirt, and making a new vernal pool is no exception to that rule. I'm grateful for Tom's offer to work with educators to help design vernal pools for their school grounds. Hopefully, some of you will be able to take advantage of his generous offer. I know I can't wait to work with him and see what might be possible on our own farm. Creating some vernal pools in shallow wetlands has been a dream of ours pretty much since we've moved here. So this opportunity is super exciting for me, and I can't wait to share it with you as we go. If you decide to take on a similar adventure, please share it with us too. It's always fun to see what others are doing as well. Before I wrap this up, I want to ask you to please tell someone else about this podcast. Word of mouth really is the fastest way for a new podcast to grow, so your help in letting others know about the Backyard Ecology podcast is greatly appreciated. And until next time, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yards and community.